10 minutes. That's how long it took for Grant Holloway to erase his wife from existence. While Marilyn was lying unconscious after an emergency C-section, fighting for her life, her husband walked down that hospital hallway, sat with his lawyer, and signed the divorce papers without a single question. He didn't ask if she would survive. He didn't ask if their 3 premature babies were breathing. He just wanted to know one thing: how fast can this be done? Then he texted his mistress a single word: yes. But here's what Grant didn't know. The woman he just threw away like yesterday's newspaper was sitting on a secret worth more than everything he had ever built. And every cold, calculated move he made from that moment on was tying the noose around his own empire. This is a story about what happens when a powerful man confuses silence with surrender and patience with weakness. It's a reminder that your darkest moment doesn't define you. Your response to it does. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off by someone who thought you'd never get back up, the story was made for you. Stay until the very end, because the moment she walks into that boardroom will take your breath away. And if this story moves you, leave a comment telling me about the time someone counted you out. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.
I woke up to an alarm I didn't recognize, and a strange emptiness in my body, like something had been stolen from me. My throat was so dry, and my head was just throbbing. For a second, I couldn't figure out where I was or why I couldn't feel my legs. Then all the pain came rushing in. I tried to sit up, but a terrible ache ripped through my stomach, and I couldn't help but let out a gasp. A nurse quickly came to my side, putting a soft hand on my shoulder. "Easy now," she said in a gentle voice. "You've been through quite an ordeal." "My babies," I whispered. My voice was just a raw crackle from the breathing tube they'd taken out hours ago. "Where are my babies?" The nurse paused. It wasn't for long, but it was long enough to scare me. "They're in the neonatal intensive care unit," she explained. "They're alive. They're fighters. Very tiny, but stable for now." I felt such a wave of relief that it made me dizzy. Tears just started streaming down my cheeks into the pillow. "Can I see them?" The nurse sort of looked away. "There are a few things we have to go over with you first." Then a man I'd never seen before came into the room, holding a tablet, not a bouquet of flowers. His hospital badge said he wasn't a doctor. "Mrs. Parker," he began, then corrected himself, without a hint of apology. "Miss Parker." That single word hit me harder than the surgery. "There has been an update to your marital status," he went on, his voice flat as a board. "Your divorce was finalized early this morning." I just stared at him, positive I had misunderstood. "That's not possible," I told him. "I was unconscious." "Yes," he said, "but the paperwork was all valid." My heart just started pounding in my chest. "Grant wouldn't do that." "He already has." The man tapped on his screen and showed it to me. There was Grant's signature, looking so bold and familiar. My own name was typed right below it, authorized and executed. The date, the time, it was all so precise, so final. "You are no longer covered by Mr. Holloway's insurance," he continued. "The hospital has moved you to a different room. Your children's medical care is now under review until custody is figured out." My fingers dug into the bed sheets. "Those are my children." "That's currently being decided," he told me. The room felt like it was starting to spin. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice getting louder. "I want to see my husband." For the first time, the man actually looked me in the eyes. "Mr. Holloway has chosen to have no further contact." After he was gone, the nurse came back, but with a wheelchair instead of a kind word. They moved me to a much smaller room on a different floor. There were no windows, no monitors, nothing warm about it. They gave me a thin little blanket and a clipboard with forms I could barely see through my tears. A few hours later, they wheeled me past the neonatal unit. I saw them through the glass. 3 tiny little bodies, covered in wires and plastic, fighting battles I couldn't help them with. I reached my hand out, but the chair just kept rolling. It was in that moment that I finally understood what had happened. I hadn't just been divorced. I had been completely erased. And as I lay there alone that night, clutching the hospital bracelet Grant had paid them to cut off, a soft knock came at my door. A knock that would change my entire understanding of how alone I really was. At that same time, Grant Holloway was standing before a mirror in his Park Avenue penthouse, fixing the cuffs on his expensive shirt as the sun streamed through the huge windows. The city of Manhattan stretched out below him, looking sharp and under his control, just the way he liked it. Everything was peaceful, organized, and clean, just as he had arranged. His phone buzzed on the marble countertop. It was a calendar alert for his 9 a.m. investor breakfast. He had a sip of black coffee and scrolled through his messages from the night. Notes of congratulations, a few careful questions, but no one fighting him. No problems at all. The divorce had been handled just like his lawyer said it would be, efficiently. He hadn't gotten much sleep, but that didn't bother him. He felt more free than he had in months. No more trips to the hospital. No more emotional messes. No more having to explain things. I, Marilyn, had become a problem the minute the pregnancy got difficult. In his world, 3 premature babies were not a gift. They were a risk, and Grant Holloway always got rid of risks quickly. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had known long before the ink was even dry on our divorce papers. "It's done," he said when Belle answered. She let out a soft laugh on the other end. A sound that was bright and relieved. "I told you it would all work out. You just had to be firm." Grant smiled a little. I always am. Belle was already at the plaza, waiting for him later that night, setting up a little strategic appearance. Nothing too official yet, just enough to get the idea out there. A new chapter, a new look for him, a woman who stood beside him, not one who was lagging behind. When he stepped onto the elevator, Grant let himself feel a moment of pure satisfaction. He believed the story was now his to write. He was the CEO who made the tough calls. The man who didn't let his personal life get in the way of his career. He figured no one would even ask what happened to me. By mid-morning, he was sitting at the head of a long glass table overlooking Wall Street, holding a fancy Mont Blanc pen as he talked to his potential investors. He talked about profits, about growth and expansion, and he just radiated confidence. "This company is moving into its most powerful phase," Grant said with ease. "No distractions, no instability." The men listening to him nodded, looking impressed. Then his assistant slipped quietly into the room and leaned in to whisper, "Sir, there's a problem with one of the funding sources." Grant's brow furrowed. "Which one?" "The Parker Hale Trust." The name meant nothing to him. "We don't work with them." "Not directly," she answered carefully, "but their money is behind 2 of our smaller partners. They've hit pause while they conduct a review." Grant leaned back, hiding how irritated he was. "That's only temporary." "Yes," she replied, "but they've also asked for updated information on your personal risk profile." Grant's jaw clenched. "I'll take care of it." The meeting continued, but something in the room had changed. For the very first time that day, Grant felt a small flicker of worry. He quickly pushed it down. He had lawyers, advisors, plenty of power. This was nothing. Outside, his phone buzzed again. It was an unknown number. He ignored it. In a quiet hospital room across the city, I, Marilyn Lynn Parker, was staring at the ceiling, completely unaware that my name had just been mentioned in places Grant thought I would never reach. And as Grant stood up to shake hands with investors, convinced he had cut his past away cleanly, the message he ignored was waiting for him. The system he had so much faith in was already beginning to work against him, and the woman he had cast aside had become the one quiet factor he could no longer manage. The move happened with no fanfare at all. I, Marilyn Lynn Parker, woke from a fitful sleep to the sound of wheels. The sound of wheels and voices I didn't know. You know, it's funny. The first thing I remember is someone lifting my chart from the end of the bed. The IV pole rattled a bit. No one said a word to me until I finally got up the nerve to ask, my voice barely a whisper, "Where are we going?" A nurse. She wouldn't even look at me, just mumbled something about administration orders. They took me from that lovely private room Grant had insisted on to a general floor. The lights there were so much brighter, and the walls were empty. It smelled of bleach, not the nice lavender stuff. That new bed groaned every time I moved, and the blanket was so thin. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how my whole world had flipped upside down in an afternoon. An hour or so later, a woman from billing came in, all business with a clipboard and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We just need to review your coverage," she said, so cheerful it hurt. I swallowed hard. My husband... Her fingers just stopped for a second. "Your former husband," she corrected me, "ended his authorization this morning." Those words didn't sink in right away. "So, what does that mean?" I asked. It meant, she told me, her voice a little softer then, that the special care your mother and your uncles needed would require, and I remember the phrase exactly, alternative arrangements. My heart just about beat out of my chest. "They're so little," I told her. "They need the machines." "Yes," the woman said, almost gently, "and that's why we need to know who will be responsible for the payments." Payment responsibility. It felt like the ugliest phrase in the world when talking about 3 tiny babies just trying to breathe. That afternoon, they wheeled me past the NICU again. I begged the orderly to stop just for a second. He hesitated, but he did it. I put my hand on the glass. 3 little boxes, 3 little lives. One of them moved, just a tiny bit, his hand curled up into a fist around nothing at all. "I'm here," I whispered, knowing they couldn't hear me. "I'm not going anywhere." Behind me, someone cleared their throat. "Miss Parker," a hospital administrator said, her voice sharp, "we need to discuss your discharge planning." Discharge? I turned and I could feel the panic starting to bubble up. "I can't be discharged. I can barely even walk." "Medically," she said, "you're stable enough to recover at home." "I don't have a home," I told her. She just nodded once, like she already knew. "You'll need to find some temporary accommodation." The cruelty of it all, you see, wasn't loud. It was in the paperwork, and the rules, and signatures, and in the things no one would say. By that evening, my meals were different, not as good. They gave me less pain medicine, and they said I couldn't have visitors because of space. I just lay there by myself, listening to other people's babies cry, wondering if mine cried like that too. Somewhere else in the city, Grant Holloway was signing the last insurance form with the same cold focus he used for his work. It wasn't about me, he probably told himself. It was just business. People figure things out. Back in my room, I kept looking at my phone, at all the messages I'd sent him that he never got. Blocked. My hands were shaking when I typed one last message I knew he'd never see. "They need me. Please." I didn't send it. I just curled up on my side, trying to protect a body that felt like it had nothing left to give, and let myself finally understand. Grant hadn't just left me. He was actively trying to make sure I couldn't make it without him. But as the lights went down and I closed my eyes, I had no idea that someone was already watching, that a decision was being made somewhere else in that very hospital that would quietly undo everything he had so carefully planned. And that decision, sweetheart, was made in a quiet office down the hall from the ICU, far away from all the people with their clipboards. Her name was Dr. Naomi Reed. I learned later she was standing there, staring at a computer screen that showed the files for 3 tiny babies, all flagged for a financial review. It wasn't the first time she'd seen something like it. She knew what it looked like when money tried to make life or death decisions. She took off her glasses and just rubbed her eyes. You know, she'd been a doctor for over 20 years. She'd seen miracles, and she'd seen tragedies happen just because someone decided a life was too expensive to save. The system had a word for it, of course. They called it policy. A young nurse knocked on her open door. "Dr. Reed, administration wants to confirm the plan for the Parker triplets." Naomi looked right at her. "Confirmation of what?" she asked. "That we're ready to reduce their care if the insurance doesn't clear," the nurse said, and you could see she was ashamed to even say it. Dr. Reed's jaw just set. "Absolutely not." She stood up and walked straight to the NICU, her heels clicking on the floor. The room was quiet, just the soft beeping of the machines that were helping my babies breathe. She stopped at the first incubator, just watching the little chest go up and down. "They're stable," she said, mostly to herself. "Fragile, but stable." Then she looked at my file. Marilyn Parker, age 31, emergency C-section. No next of kin listed. Divorce just hours after the surgery. Her eyes narrowed. She went back to her office and opened a file she hadn't looked at in years. It was full of old reports and notes from a case a decade ago, a time when something similar almost destroyed another young mother. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. A man named Ethan Cole answered. "It's Naomi Reed," she said. "I need a lawyer, but not for the hospital. It's for a patient." There was a little pause on the line. "Well, that's a first," Ethan said. "What's going on?" Naomi told him everything. The divorce, the insurance being cut off, the pressure to make medical choices based on money. When she was done, the line was quiet for a moment. "Do you have any idea who Marilyn Parker is?" Ethan finally asked. "No," Naomi said. "I just know she's in trouble." Ethan let out a long breath. "Then listen to me. Do not let them move those babies. Write down everything. Every conversation. Every request." Naomi's heart must have been pounding. "Why?" she asked. "Because," he said, and his voice was dead serious. "This is more than just a messy divorce. That name is tied to a trust that no one has heard from in more than a decade." She closed her eyes for just a second. She'd trusted her gut, and it had been right. She went back to the NICU and told her team, "No changes to their treatment unless I say so. If anyone gives you trouble, you send them straight to me." That evening, she came to my room herself. I must have looked so small in that big bed, tired and scared. "I'm Dr. Reed," she said so gently. "I'm in charge of the NICU." I tried to sit up. "My babies? They're alive," she said, and her voice was so strong, "and they are going to stay that way." Tears just started streaming down my face. "They're trying to take them from me." She took my hand. "Not without a fight," she promised. As she left, she sent one last email, marked confidential, with notes on everything that had happened. And somewhere far away, a legal machine that had been sleeping for years slowly started to wake up. For the first time since Grant had signed those papers, the world started to tilt back in my favor. The knock on my door came after midnight. It was a soft knock, not like a nurse on her rounds. I was in that foggy place, half asleep, hurting all over. For a second, I thought I'd dreamed it, but then it came again. "Yes?" I whispered. The door opened, and a man in his early 40s stepped in. He was tall and well-dressed, not like anyone who worked at the hospital. He looked like he belonged in an office somewhere important. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said, his voice low. Dr. Naomi Reed sent me. I pulled myself up against the pillow, my heart starting to race. Is it my babies? Is something wrong? No, he said right away. They're fine. This isn't about their health, it's about your name. I sort of frowned. You know my name. I do, he said, and he pulled a chair up close to my bed. But I have a feeling you don't know what it really means. I just laughed, but it was a bitter sound. It means I married the wrong man, I said. He didn't even crack a smile. It means Parker. The name just hung there in the quiet room. It sounded strange. That was my mother's maiden name, I said. Why does that matter? He opened his briefcase and took out a single, old-looking envelope. Because your grandmother, Eleanor Parker Hale, created one of the most private investment trusts on the East Coast. And you, my dear, are her only living beneficiary. I just stared at him. I was sure then that I was hallucinating. That can't be possible, I told him. My grandmother died a long time ago. If there was any money, somebody would have told me. They tried, Ethan said softly. But the trust was tied up in court, family fighting over it. It's been frozen for 12 years. My chest felt tight. So why is it different now? Because of a rule she put in it, he explained. A rule that only kicks in after the birth of legitimate heirs, plural. I couldn't breathe. My children? Yes, he said. The room felt like it was shrinking. So what does that mean? I asked. Do I have the money now? He shook his head. Not right away. There's a waiting period, 90 days. Until then, everything is still locked up. Hope is a funny thing, isn't it? It flared up and then died right back down. So, it doesn't help me, I said, my voice just a whisper. Not right now. Oh, it helps you more than you know, Ethan said, leaning a little closer. Because the moment that rule was triggered, you came under its legal protection. What your ex-husband did, I remember my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. You see, things like cutting off my insurance and blocking medical payments were more than just cruel. Ethan explained, they were documented attempts to financially harm me. Grant had no idea about any of it. Ethan just said, no, and that might be his biggest mistake. I felt tears on my cheeks, but for the first time, they weren't from sadness. It was this sharp, new feeling. Validation, I guess. Proof that I wasn't crazy for feeling like I'd been erased. So, what now? I asked him. He just closed his briefcase and said, now, we wait, and we make sure you and your children are around to collect what was always yours. He stopped at the door and added, and from now on, everything Grant does is being watched. After he was gone, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since I woke up all alone, I didn't feel invisible, because I learned that somewhere out there, a sleeping empire had finally noticed its heir. It was only a matter of time before the man who threw me away realized who he'd truly lost. That 90-day review period looked so simple on paper, but honey, living it felt like a prison sentence. I was let go from the hospital 2 days later with a prescription I couldn't afford and a list of instructions that assumed I had a nice, quiet home to recover in. I had none of that. I walked out of there in a coat someone had lent me, and my hospital bag was lighter than when I'd arrived. No babies to hold, just a stack of papers and a whole lot of pain. Standing on the curb, I remember hesitating to even look at my phone. I had $47 to my name, enough for one ride. I picked an Uber over a taxi because it was a few dollars cheaper, not because I had a destination. Where to? The driver asked. I had to swallow hard before I could answer. Anywhere with a long-term stay discount. We went to Queens. The driver, bless him, just nodded and pulled into traffic without a single question. The little studio I found was on the far edge of Queens. It was small and quiet, with a squeaky bed and a kitchenette that wasn't good for much. It had this faint smell of old coffee and bleach. Honestly, I didn't care. It was a place where I could lie down without feeling like I was a burden. Every single morning, I'd take the subway back to the hospital, my body still so stiff from the surgery. I would just stand there for hours, outside the NICU glass, memorizing the numbers on the monitors and the faces of the nurses. I even learned and the sounds of my baby's breathing machines. One was strong, one was a little weaker, and one of them had an alarm that made my heart stop every time it dipped. I wasn't allowed to hold them yet. Soon, everyone kept telling me. Grant Holloway never once showed up. Then, on the 5th day, a letter from the hospital found its way to my studio. The envelope felt heavy, official. It said that my former husband had filed for an emergency custody review. He claimed I was unstable and couldn't provide for them financially. My hands trembled, reading it over and over again. That night, I called Ethan Cole. "He's trying to take them," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I know," Ethan said, calm as ever. He filed the second he found out the trust was in play. So he did know. I whispered it more to myself. "He knows something," Ethan corrected me. "But not nearly enough. It's starting." That next week was harder than any surgery. The pain came back without my medicine. I only slept in short, broken stretches. Some days, I'd skip eating just to have enough money for the subway fare. I learned just how cold New York City can be when you feel completely invisible. All the while, Grant was telling anyone who would listen that I was unwell and refusing his help. That woman, Belle Knox, started appearing with him at dinners, her hand always resting on his arm. Pictures of them would pop up online, all smiles and champagne and control. Saw one by accident on my cracked phone screen while I was sitting alone on the train. I didn't even cry. On the 12th day, one of the babies took a bad turn. They called me in from the hallway, and I had to watch the doctors moving with this terrifying speed. I remember pressing my hands together so hard my knuckles turned white, just whispering promises I had no idea how I would ever keep. They managed to stabilize him, but just barely. That night, I sat on the edge of that lumpy studio bed, just staring at the wall, feeling an exhaustion so deep it was pulling me under. 90 days felt like a lifetime. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from a number I didn't know. "Miss Parker, this is Julian Cross. Ethan Cole suggested I reach out. I believe I can help. But not in the way you might expect." I just stared at that screen, my heart starting to pound, because for the first time since my world fell apart, someone wasn't offering me pity. They were offering me a chance. I didn't answer that message right away. I just sat on the edge of that thin mattress, the phone's light on my face, reading the name, Julian Cross, over and over. It didn't mean a thing to me, but I knew Ethan Cole. He wasn't the kind of man to make suggestions lightly or waste favors on just anyone. There was always a reason. I finally typed back just one word. "How?" His reply was almost instant. "Meet me tomorrow. Midtown. I'll send an address." So the next afternoon, there I was, standing outside this quiet office building, squeezed between two giant glass towers near Bryant Park. No fancy sign, just clean, simple architecture and a discreet security desk. I pulled that borrowed coat tighter around me and walked inside, my heart thumping a little louder with each step. Julian Cross stood up when I walked into the conference room. He was probably in his mid-40s, with a calm air about him. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, nothing flashy. But his eyes, they were observant. It felt like he'd already read my file and was just looking for the details between the lines. "Miss Parker," he said, and held out his hand. Thank you for coming. I shook it and sat down, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. You said you could help. Yes, he replied. But first, I need you to understand something. I am not here to rescue you. I just gave him a slow nod. Good. I don't need saving. I saw just a flicker of approval in his eyes. I know. What I can offer you is structure, time, and silence. He slid a folder across the polished table. Inside, there was a neat stack of documents, a temporary housing arrangement, much closer to the hospital, and a modest stipend that was labeled a consultancy retainer. There was no mention of charity, no hint of pity anywhere. This will keep you stable during the review period, Julian told me. It has nothing to do with the trust, it won't alert your ex-husband, and it won't hurt your legal standing. I just stared at the papers. Why? I asked. Julian leaned back in his chair. Because I have a long-standing interest in Parker Hale assets. And because I have a dislike for bullies who think patience is the same as weakness. I had to swallow before I could speak. Grant doesn't know you. He doesn't need to, Julian said, so simply. Not yet. I hesitated for a moment, then I had to ask the question that had been haunting me since the hospital. What happens if the review doesn't go my way? Julian's gaze never wavered. It won't fail. But even if it did, Grant would still lose. That got my attention. How? Because, Julian said, his voice perfectly calm. He has already shown his entire hand. The custody threats, the financial pressure, the story he's spinning in public. Judges don't like seeing patterns like that, especially when they're well documented. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. So, what do you need from me? Nothing, he replied. Except for one thing. Do not react. Let him think you're worn out. Let him believe he has you backed into a corner. A small, tired smile touched my lips. I am exhausted. Yes? Julian said, very gently, but you're not cornered anymore. In the next 2 weeks, my life began to change, but quietly. I moved into a small, furnished apartment just 10 minutes away from the hospital. I started eating proper meals again. And finally, they let me hold my babies, skin to skin. I would just sit there, whispering promises against their tiny, warm bodies. Grant, meanwhile, kept filing motions and leaking his concerns to people. He was just waiting for me to break. I didn't. Then one night, as I was sitting beside the incubator, one of my baby's tiny fingers curled right around mine for the very first time. I felt it then. It wasn't exactly hope, but it was certainty. I knew the ground wasn't shifting under my feet anymore. And somewhere across the city, Grant Holloway mistook my silence for surrender, never even guessing that the most dangerous part of the game had only just begun. From what I was told later, Grant Holloway started to notice my silence during that 3rd week. It wasn't anything dramatic. There were no angry texts, no tearful emails, no public fights. I had simply disappeared from his world so completely that it started to bother him. At first, he probably loved it. Silence, to him, meant I was giving in. It meant I was tired and overwhelmed, folding just like he expected me to. But when that silence stretched on, it began to feel like something else entirely. I can just picture him, sitting in his Wall Street office, scrolling on his phone while stock prices crawled across a screen behind him. His assistant was probably hovering nearby. Still no word from Miss Parker, she would have said, and Grant would have scoffed. Of course not. She's too busy trying to stay afloat. But he couldn't help himself. He kept checking. Hospital news, court filings, nothing. Just the same slow, quiet process. That 90 days must have felt like an eternity to a man like him, a man used to getting everything he wanted right away. At some private dinner that night, Belle Knox leaned in close to him. "You've seemed distracted," she apparently murmured. "Is this about the her?" Grant, of course, got defensive. "She's irrelevant." But Belle just smiled, not buying it for a second. "Then why do I keep hearing her family name in funding discussions?" And that must have gotten his attention. "What are you talking about?" "I just overheard someone at the gala," she told him casually. "They mentioned Parker Hale. They said it quietly, like it was a sleeping giant." I was told his jaw tightened. He said it was nothing, but when he got home that night, he poured a drink he didn't need and just stared out at the city, a deep sense of unease creeping in. He called his legal team first thing the next morning. "I want an update on Parker," he demanded. "Everything." But the report they gave him was thin, way too thin. There were no breakdowns, no desperate motions for money, nothing at all that fit the story he had been telling everyone about my collapse. Meanwhile, my own days had found a rhythm he could have never imagined. Mornings at the NICU, afternoons resting, and evenings spent reading the court documents Ethan sent over. I was just huddled up with a borrowed tablet, trying to absorb everything without saying a word. Julian would call, but only when absolutely necessary. Always brief, always to the point. "Let him talk," he told me once. "Every word he speaks, without a fight from you, is another nail in his coffin. And your father did talk." He filed a much harsher custody motion, claiming I was emotionally absent and living in an unstable place. He even leaked his concerns to a reporter he knew, being clever enough not to use my name. He wanted to make me flinch, but all he got was silence. No arguments, no interviews, no breakdown. At the end of the fourth week, one of his investors put off a meeting, and then so did another. Then a third wanted to know more about his personal legal issues. He took it out on his assistant, blaming bad timing, blaming the economy. But late one night, sitting alone in that big office, he came across a private memo he wasn't supposed to have seen. It mentioned that a huge amount of capital was about to be moved, all tied to an old family trust. His hands just froze on the keyboard. Parker Hale. On the other side of town, I was holding my littlest one, feeling that tiny chest rise and fall, a life I almost didn't get to keep. And for the very first time, I wasn't scared of the waiting, because I finally understood something Grant never could. Being quiet isn't the same as being weak. It's about being in control. And as your father finally felt the rug being pulled out from under him, he made the mistake of pushing even harder, never seeing that every single move he made was just pulling the trap tighter around his own life. Grant Holloway decided the world needed to see him. He'd been quiet for too long, and in his mind, being seen was everything. If his money people were getting nervous, if rumors were starting, the fix was simple. Show up looking like you don't have a care in the world. Look like you've already won. You had to own the story before it owned you. The charity event at the Plaza Hotel was the perfect stage. You know, crystal chandeliers, fancy tuxedos. All of Manhattan's big money was there under those gold ceilings, drinking champagne and pretending they weren't sizing each other up. Grant showed up right on time. Belle was on his arm, her hand draped on him like she owned him, while the cameras flashed. She had on this slick ivory dress that just screamed expensive and calculated. He, on the other hand, wore his confidence like a custom-made suit. "Smile," Belle whispered to him. "They're all watching." So Grant smiled. He went around shaking hands, laughing like it was easy, talking about growth and big ideas. He talked about being stable and focused, about a future without any drama. When someone asked about his personal life, he had his answer ready. "Sometimes, yeah, Denim," he said with a little shrug. "You have to make tough choices to protect the things you're building. It worked, just like he'd planned. You could see people nodding, looking like they understood. Across the room, you could see his investors whispering, not about me, but about how calm and strong he looked. He seemed completely untouchable. I imagine he felt that old familiar rush settle deep inside him. That was his world, after all. That was his arena. Belle leaned in close when they stopped by the balcony looking out over Fifth Avenue. "See?" she breathed. "They're on your side." Grant just nodded, his eyes sweeping the crowd. But then his gaze caught on someone he wasn't expecting. Ethan Cole was standing over by the bar. I heard Grant tensed up for a second before schooling his features. Ethan wasn't a man you could just ignore, but you definitely didn't want to challenge him in public. He didn't work for a company. He worked for results. Their eyes met for a moment. Ethan just gave a polite little nod. That was it. Grant let out a breath, telling himself it was nothing. He was in the middle of a conversation with some hedge fund guy when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again, and then again. Annoyed, he excused himself and stepped into a hallway where it was quieter to check the screen. It was a message from his chief financial officer. "We have a problem." Grant frowned and typed back right away. "Be specific." I can just picture him standing there, so impatient. The reply took a little longer this time. "One of our main investors just hit pause. They're worried about their exposure because of some old trust review." Grant's stomach must have dropped. "Which trust?" Those three little dots popped up, then vanished. Then came the words, "Parker Hale." That hallway probably started feeling awfully small. He typed back furiously. "That's not even settled. It's dormant." "That's what we thought," the CFO answered. "But someone has enough pull to make people very nervous. And please." Grant put the phone away and forced himself to stand up straight. He walked back into that grand ballroom with a perfect smile, laughing as if the world hadn't just tilted. But I bet the music sounded a little harsher then. The room probably felt a lot smaller. Across the city, I remember sitting by your three little hospital beds, my hand resting on the glass. I had no idea about some fancy party he was at. And you know what? It didn't matter. While your father was showing off for the world, the ground beneath his feet was already starting to give way. He just couldn't feel it yet. The news stories he expected never showed up, and that, more than anything, must have worried him. For days, the paper still called him a great leader, but behind the scenes, things were changing. Fewer invitations arrived. His calls weren't returned as quickly. Meetings he thought were set in stone were suddenly put on hold. And I, of course, was nowhere to be found. I heard he sat in his office, drumming his fingers on that glass desk. His assistant stood there, afraid to speak. "I can't find her anywhere," she'd said. "No hospital records, no court papers. She's not responding." Your father's jaw must have tightened. He probably thought I was hiding. The assistant, bless her heart, gently said, "Or maybe she doesn't have to respond." He gave her a look that could freeze fire. Meanwhile, across the city, whispers were starting. Not in the gossip pages, but in offices where real power changes hands. They started talking about the Parker Hale Trust again. Who was in charge of it? Why was it active now? Why me? Ethan Cole's name started popping up on calendars. Julian Cross canceled a few events. One of your father's partners sold off some shares. None of it was a big deal on its own, but it was a start. Your father tried to get things back under control, charged the only way he knew how, by turning up the heat. His lawyers filed a motion asking for me to have a psychiatric evaluation, using words like postpartum trauma and emotional withdrawal. It was so polished, so strategic, and so incredibly cruel. He was waiting for me to explode. He got nothing. The court just filed the paperwork and moved on. That night, Grant poured a drink and stood alone in his penthouse, just watching the city lights. Belle was out late again. He didn't even notice. He was obsessed with one thought. She should be breaking by now. But my days were quiet, and they had a purpose. The babies were putting on weight, slowly, but it was enough to make the nurses smile. I was learning how to hold them without being afraid, how to listen to their breathing, how to just sit for hours with all the machines beeping. Julian Cross came by once, for just a minute. No flowers, no big speeches. "You're doing well," was "Oh, simple." Was all he said. "I'm surviving," I told him. "That's enough for now." I didn't ask about Grant. I didn't have to. Ethan gave me short updates. "He's losing his patience," he said over the phone. "That's good." "Why?" I asked him. "Because impatient men make mistakes." Then one afternoon, while I was rocking my smallest baby, a nurse said something offhand. "A reporter called earlier," she told me, "asking if you were still a patient." My hand stopped moving. "What did you tell them?" "That we don't discuss our patients." I just nodded, my heart beating steady and calm. Grant wanted the whole world to see me fall to pieces. But instead, I had just vanished. No pictures, no tearful statements, no drama for him to use. And in a city where being seen is power, my absence was starting to say more than any accusation ever could. Because when a woman disappears but doesn't break, people start asking questions. What does she know that we don't? Who's helping her? What's she planning? Your father, Grant Holloway, was finally starting to feel it. That creeping little fear that he wasn't in charge of the story anymore, he was just reacting. And somewhere in the gears of that big financial machine he trusted so much, Marilyn Lynn Parker's name was changing from a problem he had to solve into a force he couldn't afford to ignore. Grant Holloway finally broke down and contacted me, not with a big public statement, not through his lawyers, but directly. The message came late one night, through a channel he thought he still controlled. "We should talk," it said. "For the children, for closure." I remember just staring at that phone screen, sitting at the little kitchen table in my temporary apartment. I had one baby asleep on my chest. The other two were finally strong enough that they could stay in the NICU all night without the alarms going off every hour. I didn't reply right away. I just sent the message to Ethan Cole. His response came back just a few minutes later. "Good. He's ready." The meeting was arranged for 3 days later. It was on neutral ground, a private conference room in a midtown office building he picked out himself, a place he often used for big deals. He wanted to feel in control, to be on his own turf. I agreed without arguing. When I got there, he was already waiting by the window, phone in his hand. He turned when I walked in, his face a perfect mask of concern and regret. His features were mist softened, just enough to make him look human. "Lynn," he said, his voice low, "you look tired." He was so stirred. I didn't even bother to answer him. I just sat down across the table, my hands folded, my posture calm but quiet, exactly the way Julian had told me to be. Grant let out a slow breath, as if seeing me confirmed something he already believed. "This doesn't have to be a war," he started. "We can fix this before the kids get hurt." "The kids are in the hospital," I said, calmly. "They don't know we're at war," I heard he said. He was trying to convince them. "That's why we need to look stable. The courts don't like messy situations, you see. Neither do the people with the money." That was the truth of it, wasn't it? "I've talked to my lawyers," he told me, when we finally met. "If you agree to work with me, shared custody, a set allowance, we both stay quiet, we can end this." He pushed a folder toward me. It looked generous, you know? A monthly payment, a place to live, my legal bills paid. But in return, I'd have to give up any claim to his future earnings. Promise to never speak publicly. I remember he watched me so closely while I read it. My hands, thankfully, were perfectly still. My expression gave nothing away. "This is more than I thought you'd offer," I said, my voice quiet. He relaxed, just a tiny bit. "I want to be fair," he said. I looked right at him. "Why are you doing this now?" "Because dragging this out won't help anyone," he said, so smoothly. "And I know you must be struggling." It was such a clean, practiced lie. I looked down, playing my part. "I don't want to fight," I told him. "I'm just so tired." He reached his hand out, almost touching mine. "Then don't. Just sign this." There was a long silence between us. Then I gave a little nod. "I'll sign," I said. He tried to hide how relieved he was, but I saw it. He pushed a pen toward me. A Mont Blanc, I remember, so heavy and expensive. What he never saw was the other document tucked right under the first one. It looked almost the same, a little something Ethan Cole had written up himself. I signed right where he pointed. He signed last, barely even looking at the pages. In his mind, he'd already won the whole game. When it was over, he stood up and held out his hand. "This is for the best," he told me. I shook it. "Thank you," I said. After I left, I'm sure he was smiling, thinking he'd finally put me in my place. He didn't know that by signing that paper, he'd just admitted to knowing about the very trust he was trying to escape. He'd given up the one thing that was keeping him safe. That paper wasn't a truce, my dear. It was my consent to spring the trap. The first call, I heard, came at 6:42 in the morning. Your father was in the middle of his workout, with the city still dark, when his phone started buzzing. It was his finance chief. A call that early is never good news. "What is it?" your father snapped. "We have a problem," the man said, his voice strained. "3 of our biggest partners froze their funds overnight," and Grant grabbed a towel. "Is it temporary?" "No, it's indefinite. They're talking about some clause alignment issues." I can just picture your father's jaw tightening. "Which clauses?" There was a long, telling pause on the other end of the line. "The ones tied to that new agreement you signed last week," his man said so carefully. "The one that mentions protected beneficiary exposure." A flicker of annoyance probably crossed your father's face. "That was just standard language." "That's what we all thought," the man replied. "But our lawyers see it differently." Your father hung up without another word. By 9 o'clock, his email was a disaster. By noon, his schedule was full of cancellations. He just sat at his desk, spinning that expensive pen, forcing himself to stay calm. He'd signed thousands of papers. He didn't make mistakes. Then his assistant knocked. "Legal needs you. Now." In the conference room, 2 lawyers waited for him, their faces grim. On a large screen was a paragraph from the agreement I had signed. "This addendum," one of them started, "it activates certain disclosure rules." Your father leaned in. "What trust?" The whole room went quiet. "The Parker Hale Trust," the lawyer finally said. "Your signature confirms you knew it had been activated." Your father actually laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "That trust is ancient history." "It isn't," the lawyer said. "And it's active." It was then, I think, that his stomach must have dropped. "Since when?" he asked. "Since your triplets were born." The words just hung in the air. "Are you saying," he said, very slowly, "that by signing that paper, I admitted to knowing about a trust I knew nothing about?" "Yes," the lawyer told him, "which means everything you've done could be seen as trying to pressure me financially." Your father shot up from his chair. This is crazy. She can't even access that money yet. Access was never the point, the other lawyer said. Protection is. By lunchtime, the news was spreading like wildfire. Your father's next big project was suddenly put on hold. He locked himself in his office, just trying to breathe. I'm sure he kept replaying our meeting in his head. My tired voice, my quiet agreement. It must have dawned on him then that he had misjudged me completely. Meanwhile, I was in a small room with Ethan Cole and Julian Cross. Nobody was celebrating. It's all happening faster than we thought, Ethan said, looking at his phone. Julian just nodded. He's exposed, and now he knows it. I looked down at my own hands. What do we do now? Julian looked right at me. Now, he said, he'll start to panic. And right on cue, my phone buzzed. It was your father's name on the screen. I just let it ring. Back in his tower, he must have stared at that unanswered call, a cold fear creeping in under all that anger. For the very first time, I think he finally understood. I hadn't been waiting for him to show me mercy. I had been waiting for him to sign his own confession. And as the world he knew began to turn away from him, the empire he built on being in control began to fall apart, one signature at a time. The boardroom was on the 42nd floor, looking down on Wall Street like it was a kingdom. Your father had held court at that table so many times. But that day, he just stood by the window, watching the tiny cars below. The meeting had been called by his own board, which was how he knew just how bad things had gotten. When he finally turned around, the room was almost full. Lawyers, advisors, even a couple of big investors who never came to these things. No one would look him in the eye for more than a second. You could feel the tension in the air. Then the door opened one last time. He was probably expecting another lawyer, but instead, it was me who walked in. The entire room went silent. I wasn't dressed to impress, just a simple navy dress. My hair was pulled back. I stood up straight and walked calmly. I didn't look like a victim. I didn't look broken. I looked like I was ready. I saw his breath catch in his throat. "What is she doing here?" he snapped. Julian Cross came in, right behind me, closing the door. "She is here," Julian said, his voice perfectly steady. "Because I invited her, and because the board agreed." A little ripple of murmurs went around the table. I just met. I finally saw Grant's eyes, really saw them, after weeks. He wasn't angry, not even triumphant, just clear. And that, my dear, shook him more than any rage could have. I remember sitting down at the big table, folding my hands just as I had the last time, which I think unnerved him. The chairman started carefully, saying they knew about his personal legal issues and how it might affect the company. Grant went to speak, but I was faster. I told them I wouldn't take much time. My voice felt so steady then. "This isn't about our marriage," I said. "It's about risk." And every head in that room turned to me. I explained that the Parker Hale Trust had finished its review, and while the money was still tied up, the protections for the beneficiaries were very much active. Any group tied up in his coercive behavior would face a review. I watched the blood just drain from his face. He started to say, "That's not..." But Julian cut him off. "It is," he said, "and we've sent the papers." A screen lit up with dates, his own signatures, all his legal moves, but framed in a way he never saw coming. "This isn't about collapse," I told them calmly. "It's about accountability." The chairman asked if I was there for money. Can you imagine? I just shook my head. "No." Grant looked at me so sharply. "I'm seeking distance," I said, "for my children, from a life that values image over people." The room went dead quiet. They were all looking at each other, making decisions without a single word. Grant's voice finally came out, a whisper. "You planned this." I just met his eyes, for what felt like the last time. "No, Grant," I survived it. Then I stood, nodded to the board, and said that was all. Julian followed me as I left the room, and the door shut so softly behind us. He was left standing there, alone, surrounded by people who no longer saw him as the answer. It's funny. I did what he never thought was possible, and not by begging or shouting. I just stepped back into his world and let the light in. The real change, it didn't come with a crash. It came quietly, the way power always shifts. By lunchtime, Grant's whole calendar was wiped clean. Confirmed meetings just vanished. Investor calls went to voicemail, on purpose. Down the hall from his office, people would stop talking when he walked by. The same men who used to laugh too hard at his jokes wouldn't even meet his eye. At 1:17 p.m., the chairman asked to see him again. This time, I heard he didn't even go to the window. He just sat, his jaw set, trying to look in control. He saw the same men, but they were different now, leaning back, judging him. "We've reviewed the risk," the chairman began, "and the outside pressure." Grant just nodded, calling it temporary turbulence. Then an investor spoke up. "It's more than that. 3 funds have pulled out." Grant's head snapped up. "Not sold off," the man explained, but paused. Waiting to see the outcome, he must have felt a cold dread then. "Outcome of what?" he asked. "Your leadership," another one said, and the word just hung in the air. Their lawyer slid a paper to him. "Your choices, while not illegal, have put the company at risk, both its reputation and with regulators, especially after what came out about the trust." He tried to push it back. "This company is me," he said. The chairman looked right at him. "That used to be an asset." Silence. You could have heard a pin drop. "We're using the contingency clause," the chairman went on. "Effective now, we're appointing an interim CEO." Grant gave this sharp, bitter laugh. "You're sidelining me over a personal matter." And the chairman just said, "We're protecting the company from instability." Oh, the irony. At that very moment, I was in the NICU, holding one of you, with your siblings sleeping nearby. Dr. Reed smiled and told me how well you were all doing. I started crying, but from relief, not fear. My phone buzzed, an unknown number. I didn't answer it. Back in that room, Grant stood up slowly, fixing his jacket. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "She can't even touch the trust money yet." But their lawyer just quoted Julian's words. "Access isn't the point. Influence is." That was it. For the first time, Grant had absolutely nothing left to say. That evening, they sent out a memo, all carefully worded about a leadership transition and strategic realignment. The market got nervous, but it didn't panic. The stock just dipped a little. He went back to his penthouse, all alone. Belle's things were gone. Just a note on the counter that said, "I need space." He just stood there, staring at the city with a drink he never touched. He was just starting to realize that everything he'd built was based on belief, and belief is so terribly fragile. And as your father finally felt the weight of it all, he still couldn't see the worst part. This wasn't the end of his reckoning. It was just getting started. And Belle knocks. She found out the world had changed when her invitations just stopped. At first, she probably told herself it was just a slow week in Manhattan. Things always came in waves. But after a few unanswered texts and canceled lunches, she couldn't deny it anymore. Her schedule, once full of parties and dinners, was suddenly blank. She'd sit alone in some cafe, watching online stories of women she used to know, in the same rooms, under the same lights, only she wasn't there. Her name had just gone cold, which was a death sentence in that world. A few weeks before, being with Grant opened every door. Now, it made them pause. Whispers started to follow her into the few rooms she could still get into. Never loud enough to fight, just sharp enough to cut. She bet on the wrong person. She reached too high. She thought she was untouchable. I heard she tried to look strong, thinking she still had Grant. She went to his penthouse one night, didn't even call. She let herself in with a key he'd once given her, like it was some kind of promise. The place was dark and so quiet. Grant was by the window, his jacket off, looking at the city like it had personally let him down. "You should have told me," Belle said, her voice cutting the silence. He didn't even turn around. "Told you what?" "That your world was on fire," she snapped back. "I'm being shut out everywhere." He finally looked at her then, his eyes so tired. "This isn't about you." "It became about me when your mess ruined my reputation," she shot back. And he laughed, softly. That woman, Belle. Her world crumbled so fast. He told her she hadn't stood by him, but by his power, and was just realizing it wasn't hers to keep. You can imagine how that felt. The very next morning, her agency brought her in for a 12-minute meeting. They used words like conflict risk. They didn't fire her, but they didn't renew her contract, which was a polite way of erasing her. By that afternoon, more calls came, more clients backed away. All the while, my name, Marilyn Lynn Parker, started being spoken in rooms she couldn't enter anymore. Not as gossip, but with a new weight. People were careful, respectful, as if trying to undo a mistake. Belle tried one last thing, calling a reporter to leak stories about the divorce, a little push to shift the blame. But the story never saw the light of day. A message came back instead. A little warning passed through a friend. No one was going to touch that story. That night, she packed her belongings from his penthouse. There were no fights, just a quiet efficiency. I picture her leaving the key on the counter, right next to that whiskey glass he'd been staring at for days. And all the way across town, I was in a dimly lit apartment Julian had found for me, rocking one of my babies to sleep. I didn't even think of Belle's name then. She was just a woman who learned a hard lesson that night. You can't win by standing next to a man who sets fire to everything. You just get burned too. And as she faded from view, the ripples of Grant's choices kept spreading, finding everyone who thought being close to his power would keep them safe. It never does. Your Grandpa Grant stood outside that hospital for almost 10 minutes before he finally came inside. The building was the same, but for him, everything had changed. Those big revolving doors weren't an entrance he owned anymore. They were a line he probably felt he shouldn't cross. But he smoothed his coat, an old habit, and walked in. The receptionist asked if she could help. He wanted to see Marilyn Parker, he said, his voice low. I can just imagine him saying my name like that. The woman told him no one was listed by that surname. He swallowed, then asked for Lynn. After a moment, she gave him the room number, 612, and told him visiting hours ended in 20 minutes. He walked away quickly, probably so she wouldn't see the relief on his face. The hallway was so quiet, every footstep must have echoed. He paused at my door, his hand just hanging there. He never was good at apologies, you know, and he certainly wasn't good at admitting he was wrong. But this wasn't one of his business deals. He finally understood that. When he knocked, I just said, "Come in." I was sitting by the window, holding one of your uncles, with the other two sleeping nearby. The city lights were soft. I was tired, but I felt solid, in a way I hadn't in a long time. He shut the door and told me I looked well. I didn't say thank you. I just asked him why he was there. It seemed to throw him off. "I needed to see you," he said, "to talk." I remember adjusting the baby in my arms before I looked him in the eye. "You had plenty of chances to talk," I told him. He sighed and said he didn't understand back then. And I said, "No, You understood perfectly. You just didn't care. That stung him. That's not fair, he said. I just tilted my head. Isn't it? The silence, after that, was so heavy. His confidence just seemed to evaporate in that quiet room. I've lost control of the company, he finally admitted. The board had pushed him aside, and investors were gone. Everything was different. I just listened. I never meant for it to go this far, he told me. And that was it. Right there. That's the problem, I said quietly. You never thought it would. He stepped a little closer then, lowering his voice. He said, we could still fix this. For the kids. That word just hung in the air. My heart didn't get angry. It just got very, very firm. You don't get to use them now. They're my children, he said. And you walked away from them before they could even breathe on their own, I answered. My voice was completely steady. I made mistakes, he said, his shoulders slumping. Yes, I told him. And mistakes have consequences. And 40. He looked at the babies, at the life he'd almost destroyed. I don't want to be your enemy. I don't need an enemy, I said. I need distance. He opened his mouth to argue, but then he just closed it. There was nothing left for him to say. He had no power there, no leverage. All he had was regret, and it had arrived far too late. I'll respect whatever you decide, he said, so quietly. I gave him a single nod. You'll respect the court's decision. He turned to go, but stopped at the door. You were stronger than I thought. I met his eyes one last time. I didn't become strong, I told him. I just remembered that I already was. He left without another word. I looked down at the tiny baby in my arms, his breathing so steady and real, and I kissed his forehead. My heart was calm for the first time in what felt like forever. The man who thought he controlled my whole world had come back, only to find out I didn't need him for a single thing anymore. The custody hearing was on a Tuesday morning. The courthouse still had that clean coffee smell. I was Marilyn Lynn. Parker and I walked in quietly, wearing a simple dress. Julian Cross came with me, but only to the security gate. I went the rest of the way by myself. I didn't need any armor that day. Your grandfather was already there when I walked into the courtroom. He looked smaller, somehow. His usual confidence, all worn away. His lawyer was whispering to him, but it sounded hollow. When I sat down across from him, he glanced at me for just a second before looking away. The judge came in, a woman who looked like she'd seen it all. She got right to it. We were there, she said, to figure out custody for the Parker Holloway children. His lawyer went first, talking about stability and money, all the usual things. He even brought up how sick I'd been, and my temporary apartment, and the fact that I didn't have an income. He tried to make his concern sound like responsibility. When it was my turn, I stood up. I'm not here to argue about who has more money, I said. I'm here to show who showed up. My lawyer handed over all the proof, hospital records, logs of who visited and when, statements from all the nurses. Then, Dr. Naomi Reed testified. She was so calm and clear, and her words were just devastating for him. These infants survived because their mother was present, she said, consistently. She explained that when the insurance was cut, when all the support was gone, I never left their side. His lawyer objected, but the judge just shut him down. Then came the proof of his actions, the insurance being canceled, the timing of it all. He started fidgeting in his chair. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Holloway, she said, do you dispute that you cut off medical coverage just hours after your wife's surgery? He mumbled something about legal advice. And do you dispute, the judge pressed on, that this happened while you were in business negotiations? He said nothing. The decision came down very quickly after that. Primary physical and legal custody is awarded to the mother, she said. He could only have supervised visits, and only after he took a parenting class. Grant just seemed to collapse in his chair. I didn't even smile. I just let out a breath I'd been holding for months. He tried to stop me in the hallway outside. "This isn't fair," he said. I turned and looked right at him, not with anger, just with clarity. "It's appropriate. You're cutting me out," he said. "No," I told him. "You stepped away." I just closed the door. And then I walked right past him, toward the sunlight pouring through the big windows. Julian was waiting. He knew just by looking at my face. "It's done," I said. I nodded. "Good." I remember walking back to the apartment that night. You three were waiting in your little cribs. I went to each of you, just touching your tiny hands. It was the only way to make it all feel real. My phone buzzed just once. It was Ethan. The custody order was filed. It was final. A small smile crept onto my face. For the first time, there was no shadow hanging over me, no waiting, no fear. The law had finally spoken, and it had chosen me. Grant Holloway lost his last bit of control that day. Not his company, but the silly idea that power could ever replace just being there. The apartment felt different the next morning, not bigger, just peaceful. A kind of quiet I'd never known. The sun peeked through the blinds, landing on the 3 cribs lined up against the wall. Each of you was a tiny, sleeping miracle I still couldn't quite believe was mine. I stood there, barefoot on the floor, holding a warm mug of real coffee. The good stuff. Not that vending machine sludge. Just watching you all breathe, so steady, I felt this calm settled deep inside me. 90 days went by, just like that. The Parker Hale Trust Review ended quietly. No big announcement, just a meeting room and Ethan Cole's calm voice telling me what was always true. "The trust is fully yours now," he said. "You have complete authority." I just nodded. The words were big, but I didn't feel like celebrating. Money had stopped being some abstract thing when I lost everything. Now it was just a tool to keep you all safe. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't even change my name. I did something quieter. I paid off all the medical bills, every last one, for every nurse, every doctor, every single night that kept you all alive. Then I set up a fund for other premature babies at that same hospital. Kept it anonymous. No plaques or anything. After that, I just went home. Julian Cross came over one afternoon. He wasn't carrying a briefcase, just a bag of groceries. He put them down, rolled up his sleeves, and helped me fix 3 of the world's tiniest bottles. I couldn't help but laugh at the wonderful chaos of it all. "You don't have to do this," I told him. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." We were a little clumsy around each other at first, building respect before we even thought of romance. Julian never wanted thanks, never pushed. He just kept showing up. That meant more than any words could. One evening, after you all were finally asleep, we sat on the balcony, with Manhattan all lit up in the distance. Julian turned to me, his expression so serious. "I don't want to be another man who comes into your life because of what you survived," he said. "I want to be the one who stays because you chose me." Tears just sprung to my eyes, so unexpected and warm. "I'm not looking for a savior," I whispered. "I know," he smiled. "I'm just asking if I can walk beside you." My answer was 2 words. I am. Meanwhile, across town, Grant Holloway was looking at a different view from a much smaller office. His interim replacement had become permanent. His name didn't mean power anymore, just risk. He'd see pictures of my new life online sometimes, never my face, just glimpses. He never reached out again. I didn't think about him much. Then, on a quiet Sunday, Julian was on the floor with me, and you 3 were gurgling between us, and he asked me a question. No drama, no show. No audience, no ring yet. just the truth. Will you build a life with me? He asked. I looked at you three. Then I looked at this man who never once tried to own my future. Yes, I said. It was that simple. Because my reward wasn't revenge. It was getting to choose, feeling safe, being loved, and having a life that was all mine. And as I closed the door on that old, broken life, I stepped right into the one I'd earned. Strong, whole, and finally free. Our wedding was small, tiny for Manhattan, but it was perfect for us. No reporters, no cameras in the bushes, just a quiet garden by the Hudson River. The afternoon sun was filtering through the trees, like the world decided to be gentle with us for a day. White chairs, simple flowers, and three little bassinets right there in the front row, surrounded by the people who had truly earned their place in our lives. I, Marilyn Lynn Parker, walked down that aisle so slowly, not from nerves, but because I wanted to soak in every single step. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and the river. Julian was waiting for me, so calm and steady. He wasn't putting on a show for anyone. When he took my hands, he didn't talk about fate, just the truth. We choose each other, Julian said, his voice so quiet but clear. Every day, especially the hard ones. I nodded. My eyes were shiny, but I didn't cry. That's all I ever wanted. We were married just as the sun began to set. Later, as our friends lingered with quiet laughter and the sound of glasses clinking, I stepped away for a moment. I watched you three sleeping, your little chests rising and falling with a rhythm I once prayed to see. Julian came and slipped his hand into mine. No words needed. Across the city, in a very different kind of room, Grant Holloway watched that same sunset from an office that wasn't his anymore. It was quiet there, too, but not peaceful. His phone buzzed with an alert about some award being given to someone else. He didn't even read it. Grant tried to start new things, smaller deals. But nothing worked like before. It wasn't that he wasn't smart. It's just that trust, once you break it so publicly, never really comes back. He thought of me sometimes, I'm sure, not with anger, but with something much heavier, regret. He thought power would protect him from everything. In the end, that belief cost him everything that mattered. Back in the garden, I raised my glass. It wasn't for winning, but for being grateful. To second chances, I said softly, and to the people who show up. There was no need to even mention Grant. He wasn't part of my story anymore. He was a problem solved by time, the law, and his own bad decisions. As the evening wrapped up, I carried one of you while Julian held another, and a good friend carefully held the third, our little family, moving together, perfectly imperfect, into the life that was waiting for us. Later that night, in our new home, the wedding ring felt warm on my finger. I thought back to that hospital hallway where everything was stripped away from me. I smiled, not because I had won some fight, but because I had survived. I rebuilt, and I chose to be happy, all on my own terms. Grant Holloway would probably spend the rest of his life explaining what happened. I would spend mine just living well. And that, my dear, was the real difference. Because the best justice wasn't seeing him fall. It was the full, peaceful, happy life I built after he was gone, surrounded by love and dignity and everything he thought I'd never have. So, that's how Marilyn's chapter came to a close. And if you're still here, if you stayed through every twist and every heartbreak, then I think some part of this story spoke to something real inside you. Maybe you know what it feels like to wake up one day and realize the person who promised to protect you is the same person tearing your world apart. Maybe you've sat alone in a room that felt too small, wondering how everything fell apart so fast. Or maybe you're in that season right now, where it feels like the whole world has moved on and forgotten you exist. I want you to hear something, and I mean really hear it. Marilyn didn't win because she had money. When everything happened, she had $47. She didn't win because she had powerful friends. She didn't even know Ethan Cole or Julian Cross existed. She won because she refused to let someone else's cruelty define her worth. And that is the real lesson of this story. You see, Grant Holloway believed in a very simple idea that power means control. Control over people, control over outcomes, control over the story everyone tells about you. And for a while, it worked. He controlled the divorce, the insurance, the custody threats, even the way people at dinner parties talked about him. He had the money, the lawyers, the connections. By every measure the world uses, he was winning. But here's what Grant never understood. There's a kind of strength that doesn't show up in a boardroom or a bank account. It's the strength of a mother pressing her hand against glass, whispering promises to babies she isn't even allowed to hold. It's the strength of a woman who skips meals so she can afford the subway fare to sit outside the NICU for another hour. It's the strength of choosing silence, not because you have nothing to say, but because you know that every word your enemy speaks, without opposition, is another mistake he's making. Marilyn's silence wasn't weakness, it was discipline. And in a world that rewards the loudest voice, that kind of quiet courage is the most powerful thing there is. There's another lesson here, and it's one that matters whether you're going through a divorce, a betrayal, a job loss, or any moment where life strips everything away. And that lesson is this: you do not need to destroy the person who hurt you. You just need to outlast their worst version. Grant destroyed himself. Every motion he filed, every story he leaked, every insurance form he signed, those were his choices. Marilyn didn't have to fight dirty. She didn't have to scream or beg or make a scene. She just had to survive long enough for his own actions to catch up with him, and they always do. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you been tempted to react in anger, to match someone's cruelty with your own? How many times has the pain been so sharp that you wanted the whole world to see what was done to you? That impulse is human. It's understandable. But Marilyn's story shows us a different path. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who expects you to fall apart is simply to keep going. And then there's Julian. Pay attention to the way he entered her life. He didn't come with roses or rescue fantasies. He came with groceries. He rolled up his sleeves and helped make baby bottles. He said the most important words a person can say to someone who's been broken by love. I'm not here to save you. I'm asking if I can walk beside you. That's what real partnership looks like. Not someone who needs you to be broken so they can feel strong. Not someone who shows up for the highlight reel, but someone who's there for the 3 a.m. feedings and the messy, exhausting, ordinary days. Someone who earns the right to stay. So here's what I want you to take with you tonight. Your value was never determined by the person who left you. It was never measured by the bank account they drained or the doors they slammed shut. Your value lives in the quiet, steady way you get back on your feet. It lives in the promises you whisper to the people who depend on you, even when you have no idea how you'll keep them. It lives in the choice to rebuild with dignity instead of tearing down with rage. And if right now you're in the middle of your own 90 days, that painful, uncertain waiting period where nothing feels resolved and everything feels impossible, I want you to remember one thing. Being quiet is not the same as being weak. Sometimes it means you're the most dangerous person in the room, and the people who underestimate you right now are making the biggest mistake of their lives. Marilyn Lynn Parker walked into that boardroom not as a victim, but as a woman who finally remembered what she was always worth, and she didn't need anyone's permission to claim it. Neither do you. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful life lessons and emotional value to our audience. All characters, names, and events in this story are entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment and inspirational purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse or financial coercion, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline or a trusted professional in your area. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.